Imagine standing in the Roman Forum on a bright summer morning in the year 218 AD. The smell of incense mingles with sweat and perfume. Citizens crowd the streets, waiting for their new emperor to appear. They've heard rumors, whispers of a 14-year-old boy from Syria who claims to be descended from the gods. A child emperor who will bring exotic Eastern religions to the heart of Rome. What they don't know, what they can't possibly imagine, is that they're about to witness the most depraved, shocking, and bizarre reign in Roman history. A reign so extreme that historians would spend the next 18 centuries trying to decide what was real and what was propaganda. A reign so scandalous that his own grandmother would order his assassination. His name was Elagabalus, and for 4 years he turned the Roman Empire into his personal theater of chaos. This is the Midnight Historian, and tonight we're diving into the story of Rome's most controversial emperor. A story of religious mania, sexual transgression, political manipulation, and ultimately a bloody end in a palace bathroom. Everything you're about to hear comes from ancient sources, though we'll examine which claims might be true and which might be character assassination. Because here's the thing about Elagabalus: separating fact from fiction is almost impossible. But even the facts that we can verify are absolutely insane. Welcome to the shadows of history. Let's begin. To understand how a teenage boy from Syria ended up ruling the most powerful empire on earth, we need to go back. Back to a dynasty that should never have existed. Back to a family of Syrian women who refused to stay in the shadows. The year is 193 AD. Rome is in crisis. The Emperor Commodus, yes, the one from Gladiator, has just been strangled in his bath. What follows is called the Year of the Five Emperors. Civil war, chaos, legions marching on Rome, and when the dust settles, an unlikely figure sits on the throne. His name is Septimius Severus, a military commander from North Africa, and he's about to found a dynasty that will change Rome forever. Septimius does something unusual for a Roman emperor. He respects his wife. Julia Domna, a Syrian woman from the city of Maesa, becomes his closest advisor. She's brilliant, educated, surrounded by philosophers and writers. The Romans call her the philosopher queen. But Julia Domna has something more important than philosophy. She has ambition, and she has a plan. Julia comes from a family of hereditary high priests. In Emesa, they worship a sun god called Elagabal, a black meteorite stone that they believe fell from heaven. It's an ancient cult, mysterious and powerful, and Julia's family has controlled it for generations. This is important. Remember this detail, because that black stone will eventually travel to Rome, carried by a boy who believes he is the living incarnation of the god. But we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Strengthens the military and dies in Britain in 211 AD, supposedly telling his sons, "Enrich the soldiers and scorn all other men." It's advice that will haunt the dynasty he's leaving behind. His sons Caracalla and Geta are supposed to rule together, joint emperors, brothers. It lasts less than a year. According to the historian Cassius Dio, who was actually there, Caracalla lures Geta to their mother's apartments under the pretense of reconciliation. Julia Domna watches as Caracalla's soldiers rush in. Gaeta runs to his mother, bleeding, begging for protection. She tries to shield him, and Caracalla's men stab Gaeta to death in her arms. Julia Domna holds her dying son while his blood soaks her clothes. Her other son, the emperor, stands watching. When Gaeta's body finally goes still, Caracalla orders a purge. 20,000 of Gaeta's supporters are executed. And he orders something even more chilling, a damnatio memoriae. Gaeta's name is to be erased from every monument, every coin, every inscription in the empire, as if he never existed. Julia Domna survives. She has to. Caracalla needs her. She's popular with the Senate, respected by the people, and she knows how to navigate Roman politics. So she buries her grief and continues advising the son who murdered her other son in her lap. Caracalla rules for 6 more years. He's brutal, paranoid, obsessed with Alexander the Great. He commissions the famous baths of Caracalla and extends Roman citizenship to all free men in the empire. He also massacres thousands in Alexandria for mocking him and executes anyone he suspects of disloyalty. He's not a good emperor, but he's effective, and he keeps the legions loyal. In 217 AD, Caracalla is assassinated while urinating on the side of a road during a military campaign in Mesopotamia. A soldier named Martellius stabs him. The conspiracy was orchestrated by the Praetorian prefect, a man named Macrinus, who immediately declares himself emperor. Julia Domna receives the news in Antioch. Her second son is dead, her dynasty is over. According to the historian Herodian, she's already suffering from breast cancer. Within months, possibly from suicide by starvation, she's dead too. But here's what Macrinus doesn't realize. Julia Domna has a sister.
The rumor spreads through Maesa, then through Syria, then through the Eastern legions. It says that Elagabalus isn't really the son of Suemius's husband. No, he's the illegitimate son of Caracalla, a true heir to Septimius Severus, a legitimate emperor. Is it true? Almost certainly not. Caracalla probably never even met Suemius in the right time frame. But truth doesn't matter. What matters is that the soldiers believe it, or want to believe it, or at least find it convenient to believe it. Because here's the situation. Macrinus is emperor, but he's unpopular. He's cut the soldiers' pay. He's not from a noble family. He's the first emperor who was never a senator. The legions in Syria are restless, looking for any excuse to rebel. And Julia Maesa has money, lots of money. She travels to the legion camp at Raphanea with Elagabalus. She brings chests of gold and silver. She makes promises, and she presents them with a 14-year-old boy dressed in the purple robes of a Roman emperor and the silk robes of an Eastern priest. The soldiers proclaim Elagabalus emperor on May 16, 218 AD. Macrinus panics. He sends troops, but his soldiers don't really want to fight. When the two armies meet at the Battle of Antioch on June 8, 218 AD, Macrinus's forces crumble. According to Cassius Dio, who despised Elagabalus but was our best source for these events, the teenage emperor doesn't even participate in the battle. He stays in the rear performing religious rituals, but his soldiers win anyway. Macrinus flees. He's captured in Cappadocia while trying to escape to Rome. He and his young son are executed. Their heads are sent to Elagabalus. At 14 years old, the priest of Syria is now the master of the Roman world. The Roman Senate, which has no real choice, officially recognizes Elagabalus as emperor. They give him the full title: Imperator Caesar Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus. The name Antoninus is deliberate. It connects him to the good emperors of the past, to Marcus Aurelius and the Antonine dynasty. It's propaganda, pure and simple, but it works. Elagabalus begins the journey to Rome. It takes months. He's never left Syria before. He's never seen the Mediterranean Sea. He's never experienced winter, and he's the most powerful person in the world. Julia Maesa and Suemius travel with him, along with an enormous entourage, priests from the temple of Elagabalus, soldiers, advisors, and something else, something that will shock Rome to its core. Elagabalus brings the sacred black stone of Elagabal with him. The meteorite that his family has worshipped for generations is being transported to Rome. Elagabalus plans to make the Syrian sun-dog the supreme deity of the Roman Empire. He's not just bringing a new emperor to Rome, he's bringing a religious revolution. They arrive in Rome in the autumn of 219 AD. The Senate and people gather to greet their new emperor. They're expecting a traditional Roman triumph. What they get is something else entirely. Elagabalus enters Rome not in military armor, but in flowing silk robes. His face is painted. He wears jewelry. He performs a dance, a religious ritual from the cult of Elagabal. And he announces that the black stone will be housed in a new temple on the Palatine Hill, the most sacred location in Rome, where the emperors live.
The Romans are horrified, fascinated, confused. They've had emperors from the provinces before. Trajan was Spanish, Septimius Severus was African. But those emperors adopted Roman customs. They respected Roman traditions. Elagabalus does the opposite. He's determined to remain Syrian, to remain a priest, to remake Rome in the image of a Maesa. And over the next 4 years, he's going to take this determination to absolutely insane extremes. The first thing Elagabalus does is build a temple, the Elagabalium. It's enormous, lavish, covered in gold, and inside it, on a pedestal, sits the black meteorite stone of Elagabal. The emperor personally leads the procession that installs the stone, dancing through the streets of Rome in his priestly robes. But he doesn't stop there. According to the Historia Augusta, a collection of imperial biographies written in the 4th century, Elagabalus orders that all the sacred objects of Rome be brought to his temple. The fire of Vesta, which has burned continuously for centuries and is tended by the Vestal Virgins, the shields of Mars, the Palladium, the statue of Athena that Aeneas supposedly brought from Troy, everything that makes Rome Rome, religiously speaking, is subordinated to this foreign god. Now, we need to pause here and talk about our sources, because the Historia Augusta is wildly unreliable. It was written more than a century after Elagabalus died, and it's filled with gossip, exaggeration, and outright fabrication. Modern historians treat it with extreme skepticism. But we have other sources too. Cassius Dio, who was a senator during Elagabalus's reign, Herodian, who was also contemporary, and later historians like Aurelius Victor and Eutropius. All of them hate Elagabalus, every single one. And that makes our job difficult. Because when every source is hostile, when every account is written by political enemies, how do we know what's true? The answer is we look for consistency. Claims that appear in multiple sources are more likely to be based on real events. even if exaggerated. And we look for things that make sense given what we know about Roman politics and culture, and we acknowledge uncertainty when we can't be sure. So, with that framework in mind, let's continue. The religious innovations are shocking to Romans, but they're not the most controversial thing Elagabalus does. Not even close. Because, according to our sources, Elagabalus's personal life is about to become the scandal of the century. He marries 5 times in 4 years. The first marriage is political. He marries Julia Paula, a Roman noblewoman. This makes sense, it's what emperors do, they marry for alliance. But the marriage lasts less than a year. He divorces her. Then he does something unprecedented. Something that will outrage the Senate and the priests and pretty much everyone who hears about it. He marries Aquilia Severa. She's beautiful, educated, from a good family, and she's a Vestal Virgin. Let me explain why this is such a massive scandal. The Vestal Virgins are the most sacred priestesses in Rome. They tend the eternal flame of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, and they're required to remain virgins for 30 years of service. Breaking that vow is punishable by being buried alive. It's happened before. Rome takes this seriously. Emperors don't touch Vestal Virgins. It's sacrilege. It threatens the Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods that keeps Rome safe. And Elagabalus doesn't just seduce one. He marries her, publicly, with a ceremony.
His justification, according to Cassius Dio, is that the union of the high priest of Elagabalus and the high priestess of Vesta will produce divine children, godlike offspring who will rule Rome. The Senate is apoplectic. The people are horrified. The priests warn of divine retribution, and Elagabalus doesn't care. He's the emperor. He's the high priest of the supreme god. Who's going to stop him? Julia Maesa, that's who. His grandmother, the woman who made him emperor, tells him this is too far. The marriage to Aquilia Severa is annulled. Elagabalus is forced to marry someone else, another Roman noblewoman named Annia Faustina. This marriage also doesn't last, and then, incredibly, he marries Aquilia Severa again, the same Vestal Virgin, for a second time. The Roman people are starting to wonder what kind of emperor they have, and it's about to get so much worse. Because we're now entering the territory of claims so extreme, so bizarre, that historians have debated for centuries whether they're true or just malicious propaganda. We're going to examine these claims carefully, present the evidence, and let you decide. According to the Historia Augusta, Cassius Dio, and Herodian, Elagabalus doesn't just challenge religious norms. He challenges gender norms, sexual norms, everything that Romans consider proper and decent. The sources claim he wears women's clothing, makeup, wigs, that he asks to be called lady instead of lord, that he wants to be the wife in his relationships, not the husband, that he offers enormous sums of money to any physician who can give him female genitalia. Cassius Dio writes that Elagabalus painted his eyes, removed his body hair, and wore a wig, that he preferred to be penetrated rather than to penetrate. In Rome, this is the ultimate emasculation. Romans don't care if men have sex with other men. What they care about is who's dominant and who's submissive. To be penetrated is to be weak, feminine, un-Roman. The Historia Augusta goes further. It claims Elagabalus married a male athlete named Hierocles in a public ceremony, that he called Hierocles his husband, that he played the role of wife, that he had other male lovers, including a chariot driver named Aurelius Zoticus, who was reportedly blessed with particularly impressive anatomy.
The same source claims Elagabalus set up a brothel in the palace, that he stood in a doorway painted gold, soliciting customers like a prostitute, that he loved nothing more than being degraded, humiliated, treated as a common sex worker. Now, let's take a breath.
Are these claims true? Modern historians are deeply divided. Some argue that this is pure character assassination, that hostile senators invented these stories to delegitimize an emperor who threatened their power. After all, accusing a political enemy of sexual deviance is one of the oldest tricks in the book. Romans did it constantly. Julius Caesar was mocked as every woman's man and every man's woman. Nero was accused of marrying a boy named Sporus. These accusations fit a pattern. Other historians argue that at least some of this must be true, that you don't get this level of detail in multiple independent sources unless something actually happened. That perhaps Elagabalus really was what we might today call transgender or gender non-conforming. That he genuinely challenged Roman gender categories in a way that was centuries ahead of his time. And here's where it gets really interesting, because if Elagabalus really did identify as a woman, if he really did want to live as female, then we have to reconsider how we talk about him. Some modern scholars use she, her pronouns when discussing Elagabalus. Others stick with he, him, arguing we can't impose modern concepts of gender identity on the ancient world. What we can say with certainty is this: whether the specific details are true or false, Elagabalus was perceived by his contemporaries as transgressing every sexual and gender boundary that Roman culture held sacred. And in Rome, that's a political death sentence. But here's what often gets lost in all the sexual scandal. Elagabalus wasn't just partying and shocking the Senate. He was also running an empire, and in some ways he was surprisingly competent. He maintained the military. The legions stayed loyal longer than they should have, probably because Julia Maesa made sure they were paid well. The frontiers remained stable. There were no major barbarian invasions during his reign, no civil wars, at least not initially. He appointed capable administrators. His praetorian prefect for much of his reign was a man named Comazon, who seems to have been genuinely effective. Yes, Elagabalus also allegedly appointed entirely unqualified people to positions based on sexual favors or on who could drink the most wine. But the empire didn't collapse. It kept functioning. And there's evidence that Elagabalus tried, in his own bizarre way, to be a religious reformer. The cult of Elagabalus that he promoted wasn't just about replacing Jupiter with a Syrian god. It was about creating a monotheistic or henotheistic system where Elagabalus was supreme but other gods still existed subordinate to him. It's a fascinating theological experiment. It just happened to be completely incompatible with Roman religious sensibilities. The problem is that none of this matters, because Rome doesn't judge emperors on administrative competence alone. They judge them on virtus, on pietas, on conforming to what it means to be Roman. And Elagabalus fails spectacularly at all of that.
By 221 AD, Julia Maesa realizes she has a problem. The emperor she made is becoming a liability. The Senate hates him. The people mock him. There are whispers of plots. And most dangerous of all, the Praetorian Guard is getting restless. She has a solution. Her other grandson, Mamea's son Alexander, who's now about 13. He's everything Elagabalus isn't. Studious, reserved, respectful of Roman tradition. Julia Maesa pressures Elagabalus to adopt Alexander as his son and heir. In Rome, adoption is how you secure succession. It's a public acknowledgement that Alexander will be the next emperor. Elagabalus agrees. Maybe he doesn't realize what he's doing.
Maybe he's manipulated into it. Maybe he genuinely cares about his cousin. But he declares Alexander his Caesar, his co-emperor. Alexander starts appearing on coins. The Senate loves him. The people love him. And Elagabalus starts to understand that he's just made himself expendable. According to our sources, Elagabalus tries to reverse the adoption. He attempts to have Alexander killed, several times. But Julia Maesa protects her younger grandson, and she starts planning. The end comes in March of 222 AD. Elagabalus has been emperor for 4 years. He's 18 years old. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers who guard the emperor, have had enough. They're tired of the religious experiments, tired of the scandals, tired of being laughed at for serving an emperor who wears silk robes and dances in the streets. And they've decided they prefer Alexander. According to Herodian, Elagabalus and his mother Soamius flee to the Praetorian camp, hoping to rally the guards. It's a mistake. The soldiers turn on them. Elagabalus tries to hide in a chest or a latrine, depending on which source you read. He's dragged out, he's murdered. So is Soamius, who tries to shield her son just as Julia Domna once shielded Gaeta. The soldiers don't just kill them, they mutilate the bodies. They strip them naked and drag them through the streets of Rome. The corpse of the emperor is paraded past the shocked citizens, and then they throw both bodies into the Tiber River, the ultimate Roman disgrace. Denied proper burial, denied the afterlife. Elagabalus's name is damned. His images are destroyed. His inscriptions are erased. The Romans want to forget he ever existed. They want to pretend the last 4 years didn't happen. Alexander Severus becomes emperor at 13, with his mother and grandmother ruling in his name. The cult of Elagabal is suppressed. The sacred stone is presumably sent back to Syria. The Elagabalium is rededicated to Jupiter. Rome tries to return to normal. But the memory lingers. For the next century, historians will write about Elagabalus with disgust, with fascination, with horror. They'll make him a cautionary tale, an example of what happens when Rome abandons tradition, when an emperor forgets what it means to be Roman. And for nearly 2,000 years, that's how history remembered him, as a monster, a deviant, the worst emperor Rome ever had. But was he?
Let's step back and examine what we actually know versus what we think we know. We know Elagabalus was young, 14 when he became emperor, 18 when he died. He was a teenager with absolute power, raised in a foreign religious tradition, thrust into a political culture he didn't fully understand. That's a recipe for disaster regardless of anything else. We know he genuinely believed in his religion. The cult of Elagabal wasn't a joke to him. It was his identity. He was the high priest before he was emperor, and he tried to share that faith with Rome, not realizing or not caring that Rome wasn't interested. We know he had powerful women in his life. Julia Maesa and Soamius weren't just influencing him from the shadows. According to Cassius Dio, they attended Senate meetings. They sat on a women's senate that Soamius allegedly founded. They exercised power in ways that Roman women traditionally didn't, and that terrified Roman men. We know he challenged social norms. Whether the specific sexual and gender-related claims are true or exaggerated,
There's enough consistency in the sources to suggest that Elagabalus genuinely did things that shocked Roman sensibilities. He didn't perform masculinity the way Romans expected their emperors to. And we know he died violently, at 18, murdered by the same soldiers who had proclaimed him emperor 4 years earlier. Now here's what we don't know for certain. We don't know if the brothel story is true. We don't know if he really married male lovers in public ceremonies. We don't know if he actually solicited customers like a prostitute. These claims come primarily from hostile sources writing after his death. They fit too neatly into Roman rhetorical patterns of character assassination. They might be true. They might be complete fabrications. Or, most likely, they might be extreme exaggerations of real behaviors. We don't know if he really tried to get sex reassignment surgery. That claim appears in only one source, the Historia Augusta, which is the least reliable of all our sources. It might reflect something real about Elagabalus's gender identity, or it might be a sensationalist invention designed to shock readers. We don't know how much of his behavior was genuine versus performative. Was he really challenging gender norms because that's who he was? Or was he deliberately trolling the Roman establishment, using shock value as a political tool? Or was he just a confused teenager with too much power and too little guidance? And we don't know what he would have become if he'd lived. Would he have matured, moderated, become a different kind of emperor? We'll never know, because Rome didn't give him the chance.
So where does that leave us? What's the truth about Elagabalus? Here's what I think, based on the evidence we have. I think Elagabalus was a genuine believer in his God, who genuinely didn't understand Roman culture. I think he was surrounded by manipulative family members who used him for their own political purposes. I think he was probably somewhere on the spectrum of what we'd today call LGBTQ+, though we can't know exactly where or how he would have identified himself. I think the sexual stories are exaggerated but probably based on real behaviors that shocked his contemporaries. I think he made real enemies with real grievances, not just prudish senators offended by his lifestyle. He destabilized Roman religion, which was the foundation of Roman identity. He elevated his family members, especially women, to unprecedented power, which threatened the Senate's authority. He was foreign, young, and unwilling to assimilate. That made him intolerable. But I also think he wasn't a monster. He was a kid, a teenager who was in over his head. And Rome has had far worse emperors. Caligula, if the sources are to be believed, was genuinely sadistic. Nero murdered his own mother. Commodus was incompetent and cruel. Caracalla massacred thousands in Alexandria on a whim. Elagabalus's crimes, as far as we can tell, were religious transgression and sexual transgression. Not mass murder, not military failure, not destroying the empire. He challenged norms. That's not the same as burning cities. And yet, 2,000 years later, he remains one of history's most infamous emperors. Why? Because he made Rome uncomfortable. Because he refused to perform the role they expected. Because he brought his authentic self to an institution that demanded conformity. And because our historical sources were written by the very people he made most uncomfortable. So when you read about Elagabalus, when you encounter the shocking stories and the scandalous claims, ask yourself, who's telling this story? What do they want me to believe? And what might they be leaving out? The truth about Elagabalus is probably somewhere between the propaganda and the apologism.
He was neither the depraved monster of Roman historians nor the transgender icon some modern writers claim. He was complicated, contradictory, young, and ultimately tragic. But the story doesn't end with his death. Because Elagabalus's reign had consequences that rippled through the rest of Roman history. Alexander Severus, the cousin who replaced him, ruled for 13 years. By all accounts, he was a good emperor, conscientious, moderate, respectful of tradition. But he was completely dominated by his mother, Julia Maesa, who made all the real decisions. The soldiers eventually grew to resent this. They wanted a military emperor, not a mama's boy. In 235 AD, Alexander and Maesa were both murdered by mutinous troops. With their deaths, the Severan Dynasty ended. What came next is called the crisis of the 3rd century. For 50 years, Rome descended into chaos. Dozens of emperors, most ruling for only a few months or years before being murdered. Barbarian invasions, economic collapse, plague, civil war.
You can't blame all of that on Elagabalus. The crisis had many causes, but his reign was a symptom of deeper problems. The military had too much power. Imperial succession was unstable. The traditional religious and cultural foundations of Rome were eroding. Elagabalus exposed all of these fractures. He didn't create them, but he made them impossible to ignore. And there's another legacy. Elagabalus became a symbol. For centuries, moralists used him as an example of what happens when society abandons traditional values. Christian writers in the late Empire held him up as proof of pagan decadence. Medieval chroniclers referenced him when condemning sexual sin. Even as recently as the 18th and 19th centuries, historians invoked Elagabalus when warning about the dangers of moral corruption. But something interesting has happened in recent decades. Elagabalus has been reclaimed. LGBTQ+ historians and activists have looked at the ancient sources with new eyes. They've asked, what if Elagabalus wasn't a villain? What if he was an early example of gender non-conformity? What if the ancient sources discussed says more about their prejudices than about Elagabalus's character? In 2002, a coin featuring Elagabalus was the first ancient coin to feature a transgender figure, according to some numismatists. LGBT history museums have included Elagabalus in their exhibits. Novels and plays have reimagined him as a sympathetic character, a victim of an intolerant society. This reinterpretation is controversial. Some historians argue it's anachronistic, projecting modern concepts onto the ancient world. Others insist it's a valid attempt to recover a marginalized perspective from hostile sources. The debate continues. What's undeniable is that Elagabalus remains relevant. 2,000 years after his death, we're still talking about him, still debating him, still trying to understand who he really was beneath all the propaganda and scandal. And maybe that's the real legacy. Not the specific details of his reign, but the questions he forces us to ask. Questions about power and identity, about conformity and authenticity, about who gets to tell history and who gets erased from it. Think about it. Almost everything we know about Elagabalus comes from people who hated him. His enemies wrote his story. They controlled his narrative. They made him a monster for their own purposes. How many other historical figures suffered the same fate? How many people have been remembered as villains simply because they lost the propaganda war? And on the flip side, how many great emperors were actually terrible but had better publicists?
Augustus, Rome's first emperor, is remembered as wise and noble. But he rose to power through civil war, political assassination, and brutal purges. He just had brilliant propaganda and patient historians. Elagabalus had neither. This is why we study history, not just to learn what happened, but to question how we know what happened, to examine the biases in our sources, to look for the voices that have been silenced or distorted, to recognize that history isn't objective truth. It's a story told by the winners.
Let me share one more detail about Elagabalus that often gets overlooked. According to Herodian, when the soldiers came to kill him, Elagabalus was 18 years old and hadn't even started growing a full beard yet. He was still a teenager. He'd been emperor for 4 years, which means he'd been in power for nearly a quarter of his entire life. Imagine that. Imagine being 14 and suddenly being told you're going to rule the most powerful empire in the world. Imagine being surrounded by adults who all want something from you. Your grandmother wants political power. Your mother wants influence. The generals want military glory. The senators want you to be someone you're not. And you're just a kid who wants to worship his God and figure out who he is. Now, imagine 4 years of that. 4 years of everyone watching you, judging you, writing about you. 4 years of trying to be authentic in a world that demands conformity. 4 years of making mistakes that have life and death consequences. And then, at 18, you're murdered in a bathroom by soldiers who decided you weren't Roman enough. That's not a monster. That's a tragedy. Of course, Elagabalus made real mistakes. He alienated the Senate unnecessarily. He pushed religious reforms too hard and too fast. He appointed unqualified people to important positions. If he really did marry a Vestal Virgin, that was genuinely offensive to Roman religious sensibility, not just prudish conservatism. These were errors of judgment that a more experienced ruler wouldn't have made. But inexperience isn't the same as depravity, and cultural difference isn't the same as degeneracy. Elagabalus came from a different world than Rome, and he tried to bring that world with him. Rome rejected it violently, and then Roman historians spent centuries justifying that violence by making Elagabalus into everything Rome feared: foreign, effeminate, sacrilegious, and sexually transgressive. They made him a monster so Rome could be the hero. But here's what fascinates me most about Elagabalus. Despite everything, despite the propaganda, despite the character assassination, despite 2,000 years of being portrayed as history's worst emperor, he won't go away. His story endures. People are still drawn to it, still shocked by it, still debating what it means. Maybe that's because Elagabalus represents something eternal. The outsider, the person who doesn't fit, the individual who refuses to conform even when conformity is the price of survival. Every society has them, and every society struggles with how to respond to them. Rome's response was murder and damnatio memoriae. Erase him, forget him, pretend he never existed. But it didn't work, because here we are, in the 21st century, still talking about the teenage emperor who wore silk robes and danced for his god, still trying to understand him, still seeing ourselves in his story.
And that might be the ultimate revenge. Elagabalus's enemies tried to erase him from history. Instead, they made him immortal. Let's talk about the physical evidence for a moment, because we're not entirely dependent on hostile written sources. They show Elagabalus with the traditional short Roman hairstyle and military imagery. But as his reign progresses, the imagery changes. Later coins show him with longer hair, more elaborate styling. Some coins feature the sacred stone of Elagabal being transported in a chariot drawn by elephants, which apparently did happen and must have been quite a spectacle. The coins also show us that despite the later Damnatio Memoriae, Elagabalus's coinage circulated widely. The empire accepted his authority. Provincial cities minted coins in his honor. The machinery of empire continued functioning. This suggests that outside Rome, in the provinces, Elagabalus might have been far less controversial. After all, Eastern mystery religions were normal in the East. Gender non-conformity was more accepted in many provincial cultures. It was specifically Roman elites who found him intolerable. There's also architectural evidence. We know the Elagabalium was real because later sources mention its rededication and eventual demolition. We know Elagabalus carried out building projects. The empire's infrastructure didn't collapse during his reign. And we have one more fascinating piece of evidence. A papyrus letter from Egypt dated to Elagabalus's reign where an ordinary person refers to the emperor in completely neutral administrative language. No scandal, no shock, just bureaucratic acknowledgement of the emperor's authority. This suggests that for average people far from Rome, Elagabalus was just another emperor. The scandals that obsessed senatorial historians didn't matter much to a farmer in Egypt or a merchant in Syria. This is important. It reminds us that our sources give us an elite perspective. The senators and historians who wrote about Elagabalus were a tiny fraction of the empire's population. Their outrage wasn't necessarily shared by the millions of ordinary people who lived under his rule. So, we have to ask, was Elagabalus really a terrible emperor? Or was he just terrible according to a specific group of Roman elites who had particular expectations about how emperors should behave? The answer probably depends on your perspective. If you're a Roman senator who values traditional religion, masculine military virtue, and senatorial authority, then yes, Elagabalus is a disaster. He threatens everything you believe in. But if you're a Syrian worshipper of Elagabal, suddenly having your god elevated to supreme deity of the empire must seem pretty great. If you're someone who doesn't conform to gender norms, maybe Elagabalus's willingness to be different is inspiring rather than disgusting. History isn't objective, it's perspectival, and Elagabalus's story reminds us of that more starkly than almost any other figure in Roman history.
Now let's address something I've been dancing around: the sexual content. Because this is where the sources get most graphic, and it's where modern historians get most uncomfortable. Cassius Dio claims Elagabalus stood in the doorway of his bedroom soliciting men like a prostitute. The Historia Augusta claims he worked in a brothel in the palace. Herodian says he granted high offices to men based on the size of their genitals. These are shocking claims, but let's think about them critically. First, all of these claims serve a purpose. They feminize Elagabalus. In Roman culture, prostitutes are the lowest of the low, and to be penetrated is to be female, is to be weak. By casting Elagabalus as a prostitute, the sources are saying he's not fit to rule. He's not a man. He's not Roman. It's character assassination through sexual accusation. Second, these claims are physically implausible in some cases. The Emperor of Rome can't actually work as a prostitute in a public brothel without everyone knowing immediately. The Historia Augusta is notorious for inventing salacious details, so we have to take these specific stories with massive grains of salt. But third, and this is where it gets interesting, there's probably something real underneath the exaggeration. Multiple sources agree that Elagabalus had male lovers. Multiple sources agree he preferred to be sexually receptive rather than dominant. Multiple sources agree he behaved in ways Romans coded as feminine. The specific stories might be false, but the pattern might be true. So what do we do with that? If Elagabalus really did have male partners and really did prefer receptive sexual roles, so what? From a modern perspective, that's unremarkable. Lots of people are gay or bisexual. Lots of people have varied sexual preferences. It doesn't make you a good or bad leader. But from a Roman perspective, this was disqualifying. The emperor was supposed to embody Roman virtues, which was explicitly masculine and dominant. An emperor who was sexually submissive was, in their view, symbolically submitting Rome itself. It was a category violation, not just immoral, but impossible, incomprehensible. And that's the core of why Elagabalus failed. Not because he was actually a bad emperor in terms of policy or administration, but because he violated fundamental Roman categories: male versus female, Roman versus foreign, pious versus sacrilege, emperor versus priest. He was liminal, boundary-crossing, undefinable, and Rome couldn't tolerate that in its supreme leader. So they killed him, and then they tried to make sure no one would ever admire him or emulate him. They made him an example, a warning. This is what happens when you don't conform. Except it didn't work, because every generation rediscovers Elagabalus and sees something different. Medieval Christians saw evidence of pagan decadence. Enlightenment philosophers saw evidence of tyranny. Victorian historians saw evidence of Oriental corruption, and 21st century scholars see possible evidence of transgender identity or queer resistance. Elagabalus has become a Rorschach test. What you see in him says as much about you as about him.
Let me tell you about one more person in this story. Julia Maesa, Elagabalus's grandmother, the woman who made him emperor and then orchestrated his murder. She died in 224 AD, 2 years after Elagabalus. She was in her 60s, which was quite old for ancient Rome. By the time she died, she'd made 2 emperors, her grandson Elagabalus and her other grandson Alexander. She'd exercised power for decades, first through her sister Julia Domna, then directly through her daughter and grandsons. And here's the remarkable thing: the sources don't really condemn her. They condemn Elagabalus. They condemn Soaemias, his mother, for being too ambitious and controlling. But Julia Maesa, she's portrayed as wise, pragmatic, a stabilizing force. Even though she's the one who put a 14-year-old on the throne and then had him killed when he became inconvenient. Why? Because Julia Maesa played by Roman rules. She was ambitious, yes, but she channeled that ambition through male figures. She didn't overtly challenge gender norms. She didn't make herself conspicuous. She was the power behind the throne, which Romans could tolerate. Elagabalus was openly, flamboyantly different, which they couldn't. The double standard is striking. Julia Maesa manipulates imperial succession twice, effectively rules the empire for years, and is remembered as skilled and intelligent. Elagabalus wears the wrong clothes and worships the wrong god, and he's remembered as a monster. This tells us something important about how Roman society worked. It wasn't that women couldn't have power. The Severan Dynasty proved that wrong. Julia Domna, Julia Maesa, Soaemias, Mamaea, all of these women exercised real political authority, but they had to do it within acceptable parameters. And those parameters were narrow and heavily gendered. Elagabalus threatened those parameters, not just through his own behavior, but by elevating his mother and grandmother so publicly. Roman sources claim Soaemias tried to enter the Senate and participate in debates. Whether that's true or not, the fact that it's claimed shows how destabilizing the Severan women were to traditional Roman gender politics. And in the end, it was a woman, Julia Maesa, who decided Elagabalus had to go. She chose dynasty over her grandson. She chose stability over loyalty. She chose Rome over Syria. And she survived while Elagabalus died. There's a brutal pragmatism to that, a ruthlessness. Julia Maesa understood power in a way her teenage grandson never did. She understood that power isn't about being right or authentic or true to yourself. It's about knowing when to conform and when to resist, when to push boundaries and when to retreat. Elagabalus never learned that lesson. It cost him his life. As we near the end of this story, I want to zoom out and ask a bigger question. What does Elagabalus tell us about empire, about power, about the Roman world in the early 3rd century? Here's what I think. Elagabalus's reign reveals that by 218 AD, Rome was already in crisis. Not the military or economic crisis that would come later, but a crisis of identity. What did it mean to be Roman anymore? Rome had been expanding for centuries. By the Severan Dynasty, the empire stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. The majority of its inhabitants weren't Italian. They didn't speak Latin as a first language. They didn't worship the traditional Roman gods exclusively. They came from dozens of different cultures, each with their own traditions.
The emperors reflected this diversity. Trajan was from Spain. Septimius Severus was from North Africa. His wife, Julia Domna, was Syrian. The empire was becoming multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious. But the senatorial elite in Rome hadn't caught up. They still thought in terms of Roman versus barbarian, civilized versus savage, us versus them. Elagabalus forced them to confront the reality that Roman was an expanding category, and they didn't like it. An emperor who was more Syrian than Italian, who worshipped a foreign god, who didn't perform traditional Roman masculinity, that was intolerable. It suggested that Romanness itself was negotiable, changeable, not fixed and eternal. This is why they reacted so violently. It wasn't just about one weird emperor. It was about what he represented. The end of old Rome, the beginning of something new
and uncertain. And they were right to be worried, because Rome was changing. Within a century, Christianity, another foreign religion, would take over the empire. The old gods would be abandoned. The traditional Roman values would fade. The very definition of what it meant to be Roman would transform completely. Elagabalus was ahead of his time. He was trying to create a more cosmopolitan, syncretistic empire where different cultures and religions could coexist, where the emperor could be both Roman and foreign, both priest and ruler, both masculine and feminine. But Rome in 218 AD wasn't ready for that. It would take another century of crisis before the empire was desperate enough to accept radical change. So they killed the messenger. They got rid of Elagabalus, and then they pretended that by eliminating him, they'd eliminated the problem. But the problem wasn't Elagabalus. The problem was that the Roman world was outgrowing Rome itself, and no amount of murder or propaganda could stop that. Let's return to where we started, that bright summer morning in 218 AD, when a 14-year-old boy danced through the streets of Rome in silk robes, bringing a foreign god to the heart of the empire. The Romans who watched that procession couldn't have known what was coming. 4 years of religious upheaval, scandalous marriages, gender transgression, political instability. A reign that would end in murder and mutilation and erasure. But they must have felt something, a sense of wrongness, of boundaries being crossed, of the world changing in ways they couldn't control. The boy dancing through their streets wasn't Roman in any sense they recognized. He was other, foreign, dangerous. And they were right. He was dangerous, not because he was cruel or incompetent or actively destructive, but because he represented a future that terrified them. A Rome where emperors didn't have to be traditionally masculine, where foreign gods could be supreme, where the old certainties no longer applied. Rome rejected that future. Rome killed that future. And for a while, it worked. Alexander Severus brought back traditional values. Things calmed down. Rome pretended it could go back to the way things used to be.
But it couldn't. The crisis was coming regardless. The old Roman world was dying whether they acknowledged it or not. And in a strange way, Elagabalus saw that more clearly than his contemporaries. He understood that Rome would have to change. He just tried to force that change too fast, too young, with too little political skill. So what's the truth about Elagabalus? After 15,000 words, after examining the sources and the evidence and the historiography, what can we actually say? Here's what I believe. I believe Elagabalus was a teenage boy from Syria who genuinely believed in his God, who struggled with gender and identity in ways that Roman culture couldn't accommodate, who was manipulated by his family and surrounded by people who wanted to use him. I believe he made real mistakes and bad decisions, but I also believe he wasn't the monster Roman historians portrayed. I believe the sexual stories are exaggerated but reflect real behaviors that shocked his contemporaries for culturally specific reasons. I believe he was simultaneously victim and perpetrator, both the target of propaganda and the cause of genuine scandal. I believe he was complicated, human, flawed, young, and ultimately tragic. And I believe that 2,000 years from now,
If humanity is still around, people will still be arguing about what Elagabalus's story means, because it's a story about power and identity, conformity and authenticity, tradition and change. Those themes don't age. They're always relevant. Every society has its Elagabaluses, its outsiders who don't fit, its people who challenge categories and cross boundaries and make everyone uncomfortable. And every society has to decide what to do with them. Accommodate them, reject them, try to force them to conform, kill them, and erase their memory. Rome chose violence. They murdered an 18-year-old and threw his body in a river. They tried to erase him from history. They turned him into a cautionary tale, a bogeyman, a symbol of everything that could go wrong when you abandon tradition. But here we are, still telling his story, still debating whether he was a monster or a martyr or something in between, still seeing relevance in a reign that lasted only 4 years, 2,000 years ago. Maybe that's Elagabalus's real legacy, not his policies or his religious reforms or his sexual transgressions, but the questions he forces us to confront. Questions about who gets to define normal, who gets to tell history, who gets remembered and how.
Elagabalus refused to be what Rome wanted him to be. That refusal cost him his life, but it also made him immortal. And that's worth remembering. So here's my challenge to you. The next time you encounter a historical figure who's portrayed as purely good or purely evil, ask yourself, who's telling this story? What do they want me to believe? What might they be leaving out? Because history isn't truth, it's narrative. And whoever controls the narrative controls how we understand the past. Elagabalus's enemies controlled his narrative for 2,000 years. They made him a monster. But now, in the 21st century, we have the tools to question that narrative, to look at the sources critically, to consider alternative interpretations, to recognize that the ancient authors who condemned him had their own biases and agendas. That doesn't mean we can recover the real Elagabalus. He's lost to time. We'll never know exactly what he thought or felt or intended. The ancient sources are all we have, and they're hopelessly compromised. But we can at least acknowledge the complexity. We can resist the urge to make him either a villain or a hero. We can hold multiple possibilities in our minds at once. Maybe he was a gender non-conforming teenager ahead of his time. Maybe he was a delusional religious fanatic. Maybe he was a confused kid manipulated by ambitious family members. Maybe he was all of those things simultaneously. History is messy. People are complicated, and anyone who tells you they have the simple, definitive answer about a controversial figure from 2,000 years ago is either lying or deluded. What we can say is this: Elagabalus lived. He ruled Rome for 4 years. He challenged norms. He scandalized people. He died young. And his story has resonated across 2 millennia because it touches something fundamental about human society and human nature. That's enough. That's worth exploring. Even if we never reach certainty, the exploration itself is valuable. Because in examining Elagabalus, we examine ourselves, our assumptions, our biases, our categories, what we find acceptable and what we find intolerable.
And maybe, just maybe, we learn to be a little more skeptical of simple narratives about complicated people. The midnight hour is here. The story is told. Somewhere in the Tiber River, if you believe in such things, the ghost of an 18-year-old boy still wanders, still dancing, still refusing to conform, still making Romans uncomfortable, even in death. History wanted to forget him, but we remember. And as long as we keep telling his story, keep questioning what we think we know, keep seeing the humanity underneath the scandal and propaganda, Elagabalus wins. The boy emperor, who ruled for 4 years, has now influenced human thought for 2,000. That's a kind of immortality few emperors achieve. That's power. That's the final truth about Elagabalus. Rome tried to erase him, and instead made him eternal. Thank you for joining me in the shadows of history. If you found this deep dive into one of Rome's most controversial emperors fascinating, disturbing, or thought-provoking, there are dozens more stories waiting in the darkness. Stories of empires that rose and fell, of secrets that were buried and then unearthed, of humans at their worst and their most complex. History isn't comfortable. It's not supposed to be. And if Elagabalus teaches us anything, it's that the most interesting stories are the ones that make us uncomfortable, that challenge our assumptions, that refuse to fit into neat moral categories. The past is darker than you think, but it's also more human, more complicated, more relevant to today than we usually acknowledge. And that's why we keep digging, why we keep questioning, why we keep returning to these ancient stories and finding new meaning in them. Welcome to the midnight hour. This is where history gets interesting.